Hi, I'm Dave Kassler, amateur radio, call sign KE0OG. This is not a ham radio video. This is an aircraft video. And where I am right now in my studies is trying to get ready to solo. And so my instructor has given me a long list of things that are required for the pattern. This is the pattern where you take off, come back around and land. This is actually a Google Earth view of the Delta Blake runway here in Delta, Colorado. It's airport Alpha Juliet Zulu, and it is in height not quite a mile high, 5193 feet above mean sea level. And it is required, because the golf course over here, that the runway 3, which is the runway most used here, is, by the way, that's 30 degrees magnetic north, which is about 40 degrees from true north. We do a right pattern on this, so it's a little bit backwards for those of you who are used to doing left patterns. So what I'm going to do with this to try and learn this, I've got this problem, I've got this list from my instructor, and I do not have a linear memory. I have a spatial memory. And I learn best by example, and then I can generalize from examples. And so I decided to go ahead and make an example of one turn around the pattern here from takeoff all the way to landing and exiting the runway. And I think I've got everything included in here. I have to get this right without my instructor having to remind me before I can solo. Now, I don't include the actual landing. That's a whole bag of cotton all by itself. But we're going to do once around the pattern here. Now, those of you who are pilots, take a look at this. Tell me what you think. Give me some suggestions, maybe whatever you might think would be good. The runway is actually kind of elevated on this little mesa right here, and so we're actually going to be a little higher off the ground down here because this is lower than the airport. Okay, step one is the pre-takeoff. We're sitting right here. The aircraft is just behind the hold short line for runway 3. We want to put flaps on one notch. Double check that the passenger has his or her seatbelt on, the radio is set up right with the right frequencies, and that there's no traffic on final or on the runway. I have actually sometimes, when it gets busy, have called and asked if there are any aircraft on final approach. And one time I did wait for a while for somebody to come in. Now, you need to do a radio call at this point. It's Delta Blake traffic, experimental 8053 Romeo, entering runway 3 for takeoff, staying in the pattern Delta Blake. You put the name of the airport at both at the beginning and at the end. This is a non-towered airport, by the way. And I don't put my N in front of the 8053 Romeo, just the 8053. Now, after this, I'll be known just as 53 Romeo until we get back on the ground. Okay, experimental is because it's a kit-built aircraft. Okay, so that's what we do there. Then we get on the runway and execute what I call a Troy takeoff. He was my last CFI, and he had a method where you hold the stick back and you accelerate at 3,000 RPM, and the front wheel will lift off. And once it lifts off, then you need to hit some right rudder to adjust for P factor, and then the whole aircraft lifts off. And you have to push the stick a little bit forward to adjust the rate of climb for 80 miles an hour. So we get airborne pretty quickly. We don't need anywhere near the whole runway. When you do get to the end of the runway, we have to remove the flaps. Remember, we had one notch of flaps. Climb out at 80 miles an hour. And then when we get to the corner here at about 600 feet above ground level, or 5,800 feet above mean sea level, we're going to turn right. That'll be a course of 120 magnetic. And it is a climbing turn. Now, we need to radio at that point. Delta Blake traffic, experimental 53 Romeo, turning right crosswind, Delta Blake. Then we go down to the point where see this 45-degree line right here? This is about where we turn. It's not absolutely critical, but it's important to do it. So we're going to turn 90 degrees to the right, about 45 off the end of the runway. Now, this is very close to where the aircraft actually achieves pattern altitude, which is 1,000 feet above the airport. We're going to radio Delta Blake traffic, experimental 53 Romeo, turning right downwind from crosswind, Delta Blake. Okay? Now, as soon as we get around the corner, we're at pattern altitude. We're not going to go any higher. And we're actually just going to go 80 miles an hour. The aircraft will do closer to 100, but we're going to trim it for 80 mile an hour cruise. We're going to set the RPM to 2,200. Idle is 1,000, full on is about 3,000, so we're running 2,200 here. The altitude is the pattern altitude, which is 1,000 feet above the runway, 6,200 feet MSL. We'll retrim the aircraft. This sets the elevator up so you don't have a lot of forward or backward pressure on the stick. Now, we move on down. When we are abeam, meaning across from the very center of the runway, remember we're at 80 miles an hour, we do what's called a carb heat check, where we apply carburetor heat. And if there's any ice in the carburetor, it should start to melt, which will cause a slight change in engine performance. If that's the case, we'll leave the carb heat on. Otherwise, we'll turn it off. Verify the passenger seat belts and ask the passenger to keep an eye out for traffic. Next, when we are abeam the touchdown point, note that the touchdown point is kind of hard to see without really zooming in. Is these two parallel lines is the actual touchdown point. We're going to start the descent. We're going to reduce RPM to 1,500, which isn't much. Flaps 1 notch. Okay, we're from 0 back to 1 notch. And now we're going to hold 70 miles an hour, which should put us into losing altitude at about the rate of 500 feet per minute. When we come to the corner, again, we get this 45 thing right here from the runway. Okay, we're going to turn onto what's called right base. We're going to turn when 45 degrees from the end of the runway. It's a descending turn. We will maintain 70 miles an hour. And this is important to make this radio call. Delta Blake traffic, experimental 53 Romeo, turning right base. We say right base because normal base is left base. It's right base for runway 3 Delta Blake. Okay, now shortly thereafter, we're going to add another notch of flaps. Now we're up to 2. There's a total of 3 available. We're up to 2. We're going to retrim. We're going to maintain 70 miles an hour. Now at this point, you're looking at the landing point, which is over here. And you kind of judge whether you're too high, too low, or just right. If you're too high, you have some tools available to you. You can add another notch of flaps, which gives you lift but also increases drag. And slow to 65 and retrim. Otherwise, we'll just have that one additional notch of flaps for the right base. Now we make the very important turn on final. I have had a problem of I tend to pull back a little bit on the stick when I turn. That's great when you're doing climbing turns, but not great when you're doing descending turns. So I need to keep the speed up, 65 to 70. A good altitude about this point might be about 500 feet above the runway. We will judge the height, and we can add a little power. We'll keep the speed at 70, but add a little bit of power if we think we want to go a little far. We can judge the height. Now, this is the last call before landing, and a very important one. Delta Blake traffic, experimental 53 Romeo, turning final for runway 3 Delta Blake. Now, once you have called final, you've basically claimed the runway. So we're going to go, now note there's no difference between a left and a right final. We're just going final on this thing here, okay? Now, as we go on down, there's some possible actions. Right here next to the runway, over here, are two lights. If one is red and the other is white, you're on glide slope. If both are red, you're too low. If both are white, you're too high. So we want to add the third notch of flaps here, keep the speed to 65 or 70, adjust the lineup to the runway, and so on, and then land. Now, I'm not making a big deal out of what it takes to land right here. This is just a pattern video. And then we will roll out on the runway. We won't roll out that far. Go easy on the brakes. There's no particular reason that you have to stop quickly. Turn the aircraft around. One way to do that is to simply jam one of the brakes. Each brake is independent, the right and left brakes. Jam one of the brakes on and just flip the thing around. We're going to back taxi, and while we are back taxiing, we're going to clean up the flaps. Go from 3 notches of flaps to 0. Okay, and then radio call here, Delta Blake traffic, experimental 53 Romeo, back taxi runway 3 Delta Blake. Now this is to let other people know that there's still somebody on the runway. And then when we get back, we're going to go past the hold short line and stop, and then do a radio call. And the radio call is Delta Blake traffic, experimental 53 Romeo, clear runway 3. So somebody who's waiting to take off can now take off. And then usually you say what your intentions are, taxi to fuel or the hangar, or maybe back to runway 3, and then end with Delta Blake. So that's the entire scenario here of doing a loop around the pattern. And those of you who are pilots, I'm sure, will have comments and maybe some additional suggestions to make it a little bit easier. Again, this is not a normal video. I may not leave it up, but I am kind of curious what you think of it. This is obviously not a training video. I'm the student. I'm not the trainer. I'm the student. This is what I'm being taught. And what your flight instructor wants you to do could be entirely different. The airplane that I'm flying is a little RANS S6ES, which has the extended span wing on it. It's an S6. There were about 1,000 of them built. It's a very nice little airplane. It's covered with cloth. It's just neat. So there you have it. And if you have any comments, or if you like this kind of thing, let me know. If you don't like this kind of thing, let me know. And until we next meet, 73.